let's talk just a minute about the Sermon on the Mount context. The question I asked was, you were going to briefly, very briefly describe the Bible context of the Sermon on the Mount. What would you say?
Gives, I guess, a tells of a reward.
Okay.
So,
What else would you say?
It's the very beginning of Jesus' public teaching.
Okay. So there's a little bit of, it depends upon how you read Matthew 5 or the Matthew's account and what some consider to be Luke's account. Matthew puts it very early. Luke puts it later. And some have suggested that those are two accounts of the same teaching. And indeed, there's a lot of overlap. I'm not inclined to accept that explanation. I'm inclined to believe that it's talking about two separate instances. And so I would agree that going with Matthew, this puts it at the near the very beginning. And that makes the most sense to me. What I want to call your attention to is actually the end of Matthew chapter 4 and how Matthew describes the context. So if you look at Matthew chapter 4, starting in verse 23, Jesus is going throughout all Galilee, teaching in their synagogue and proclaiming what?
Kingdom of heaven is.
Don't go from memory, Alan. It's true that he had been preaching the kingdom of heaven is at hand, but Matthew 4:23, he's teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming what?
The gospel?
The gospel of what?
The kingdom. That's what my Bible.
Yeah, the gospel of the kingdom. And that's really what I'm going with. What is described in Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7 is the gospel of the kingdom. Now, there are a couple of things that I think are important about that. Number one, it's described as gospel. And number two, it's gospel of the kingdom. And that's important because there are some who would try to say that in Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7, Jesus is just explaining the law of Moses. That he's just trying to point the audience back to the law. And he's just trying to reform the Jews. Okay. And so when you do that, what you do is you minimize, if not eliminate, the impact of the Sermon on the Mount on us today. Do you follow? You understand what I'm saying? But Matthew 4:23 describes the Sermon on the Mount as gospel and kingdom. And those are two words that relate the teaching to us today. Gospel is never used to describe anything prior to Jesus. And kingdom is something that Jesus came to establish and did establish according to Matthew 16:18, Acts chapter 2, Colossians chapter 1, etc. We're not going to go through and prove that point tonight, but we live in the gospel age, and we are, if we are Christians, we are citizens of the kingdom today. And so Matthew's description, Matthew 4:20, puts this teaching in a context that means it's relative to us. It relates to us, and we need to think of it in those terms. Now, does Jesus refer to the law of Moses? Absolutely. And in some ways, does he correct some misunderstandings about the law? Yeah, I think he does. But that, but the idea that it's law and not gospel, or that it's about the Jews and not us today, assumes that there aren't principles that transcend law and gospel, right? So, for example, thou shalt not commit murder. Was that law or gospel?
Both.
Exactly. The answer is yes. It's a principle that goes beyond. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Law or gospel? Yes.
Yeah.
So
Well, you-
we do see in the Sermon on the Mount Jesus referring to law, and in some ways, admittedly, correcting some misconceptions of law. We ought not to think that immediately, oh, he's talking about the law, that's not us today. That's a mistake that some people make. I don't know that that is a particular issue among us that as we're studying right now, but you need to be aware that that danger is there. Because as you hear people teach from the Sermon on the Mount, if you read things that some people will write about the Sermon on the Mount, you may very well encounter that, and you need to be prepared um, to properly understand and apply the context of the Sermon on the Mount. So, when Jesus begins, he is talking about kingdom, and he's talking about kingdom citizens. And so I have in the past just very simply and briefly outlined the Sermon on the Mount in 4 parts. Now, this is Jeremy's nickel tour of the Sermon on the Mount. Okay, it's not even worth a nickel, but in my mind, I've divided it into 4 parts. Jesus begins with the character of a kingdom citizen. And in particular, that is what the Beatitudes, what we're going to spend time with, in particular, the Beatitudes are very much about the character of a kingdom citizen. A citizen of the kingdom, what is their character? As he continues in the latter part of chapter 5, particularly beginning in about verse 20, Jesus begins drawing a contrast. He says, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of God. And so he contrasts the righteousness that was the kind of the model of righteousness in that day. In other words, most people were looking at the scribes and Pharisees in Jesus' day and saying, oh, that's what righteousness looks like. And Jesus says, no, that's not righteousness. This is righteousness. Okay, so beginning in chapter 5, verse 20, he begins to draw that contrast. Beginning with chapter 6, Jesus begins to talk about conduct. Now, that's not to say he hadn't been talking about conduct before, but he gets into not so much drawing contrast as he is just saying, do this and don't do that. And then that continues into chapter 7. And in about chapter 7, verse 13, where he begins to talk about the broad way and the narrow way and going on through the rest of the sermon, Jesus is issuing a command. He is announcing, he's giving, we might say, an invitation. He is saying, okay, you need to make a choice. You have two options here. And he's calling people to choose kingdom righteousness. And so that's Jeremy's nickel outline of the Sermon on the Mount. And here's the way I remember that. Citizen, kingdom citizen. Citizen starts with a C. Citizen, character, contrast, conduct, call. That's just my little memory device. You can do with what you want. And so, having said that, what we're looking at the beginning of the sermon, and again, particularly with the Beatitudes, we're looking at citizen character. What is the character of a kingdom citizen? Does that make sense? Everybody follow me so far? Okay. And the other thing that I would say about that is we need to be careful that we don't overly parse the Beatitudes. What do I mean by that? Well, rather than just looking at them individually, we need to see them as a whole. All right. So it's not, well, am I poor in spirit? Do I mourn? Am I merciful? But am I a kingdom citizen? And so all of these are very closely related. And it's very difficult, if not impossible, for any one of these to be true about our character and all of them not be true of our character. And so while we're going to look at them individually, we want to make sure that as we think about them, we are also thinking about them as part of an overall picture. Jesus is painting a picture of a kingdom citizen. This is what a citizen of his kingdom looks like. And I think that is, that's really important. All right, so let's just talk about this, and let's begin by looking at a few key words. Let's start with the word blessed, or as we most commonly pronounce it in the context of the Beatitudes, blessed. By the way, either of those is grammatically correct. So what does the word blessed or blessed mean?
Could mean happy.
All right, that's kind of the most common definition of the word. It means happy. All right. What else can we say about it?
Fortunate.
Fortunate. Okay, good.
A footnote in my Bible says prosperous.
Okay, prosperous. The word in its origin is the idea of fullness. That's really kind of the root idea. And so this is the one who is, we might say, fulfilled, right? We talk about that in our culture a lot. Somebody, finds something fulfilling, or you're fulfilled in life. And the idea there is that there's a certain satisfaction, right? That there's a certain quality of contentment that is involved there. The word happy seems to be a little bit lacking in my mind. Far be it for me to argue with anyone about the meaning of words. But happiness normally has associated with it circumstances, the happenings around us. We use the word happenstance. The idea is that there is something that has contributed to or that is making us happy. The idea of blessed or blessedness, fulfillment, is something that is beyond that. So even though I might not in any particular moment, because of some particular circumstance, be particularly happy, I'm fulfilled, I'm satisfied. Um, and let's think about that for just a moment. And to illustrate that, look at the last of the Beatitudes. Look at Matthew chapter 5 and verse 12. What is the last of the Beatitudes?
Peacemakers.
Rejoice and be
I'm sorry,
exceeding happy.
I said verse 12. I actually meant verse 10. I think 10, 11, and 12 are essentially one. Blessed are those who are
Persecuted for
Persecuted.
righteousness' sake.
So is Jesus suggesting that we ought to be happy about being persecuted?
Tells why you're persecuted.
Well, all right. So, in other words, do I want to be persecuted? Am I just jumping up for joy in that? Am I just celebrating in the kind of the traditional, we think of happiness? I don't think that's the point. There is joy in being persecuted. We see that in Acts chapter 5, counting it joy to suffer. But that's different than strictly happiness. There again is a sense of fulfillment. There's a sense of peace that is associated. And I think that's the deeper idea of blessing in this context. It's not just, as I'm looking at some notes, someone wrote an emotional state contingent on circumstances, but rather it is something that is radiant and complete. Even when our present circumstances are desperate. I think that's it's something that transcends what we typically would consider happiness. That's the point that I want to try to get to. Does that make sense? Do you all want to say anything or add anything or question anything about that?
I had a note that I had found that it was divinely happy.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear. It's what?
No, one of my notes that I saw was divinely
Happy. Yeah, and I think that's a good way to put it. It's a happiness that's not just about circumstances. And maybe this is a way to understand it. It's happiness that it pertains to relationship, and not just a relationship between human beings, but relationship with the Lord. And maybe that's another way to think about it. All right, so that's a key concept, a key part of understanding the Beatitudes, I think. The second thing to understand, and this is not so much about word as it is structure. And so there is blessing associated, and then there is a description of that blessing, or an outcome of that blessing. Might be the way to say it. So, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And so you have the connection of a spiritual quality, an element of character, connected to a blessing, connected to some specific outcome. So let's talk a little bit about the first, again, hopefully 3 or 4. With all our technical difficulties tonight, we may not make it that far. But let's talk about, sorry. Okay. Let's talk about this. Blessed are the poor in spirit. What does it mean? What does it mean to be poor in spirit?
My reference says humble.
Okay, good. Humble. I think that is the key idea in this. But I want to talk about this idea of poor. Um, poor is one of those words that has a wide variety of meaning, a wide variety of connotation. In other words, it's a relative term. If I compare myself to um, Bill Gates, then I'm poor. If I compare myself to XYZ Hollywood blockbuster star, I'm poor. But am I poor?
No,
Well, a lot of other people would say
materially.
would say that they are poor in comparison to me, and would consequently describe me as rich. So we need to talk about this word poor for just a moment. The word poor, even though it has a wide variety of meaning in the English, is translating a very specific word in the original language of the text. It is describing someone who is virtually destitute and is on the verge of starvation. This isn't a word that has a variety of meaning that can mean, well, you don't have as much as somebody else. In the original language, this is a word that has a very definitive meaning to describe someone who is absolutely, as we would say, dirt poor. And we don't mean that just in a poetic sense. I mean, that's literally what's being described. They have absolutely nothing. So that you understand how that word is used, this is the word that's used to describe Lazarus in Luke chapter 16. Luke chapter 16, a poor man, Lazarus, laid at the rich man's gates. How is Lazarus described? As longing to be fed with the crumbs which were falling from the rich man's table. That's poverty. That's absolute, abject, not I don't have everything I want, or I'm having to live on peanut butter and jelly and ramen noodles. That's absolutely, I don't know where my next bite of food is coming from. And so when we read the English word poor, our mind can think in relative terms. But to the original audience, hearing this in the original language, they heard the word poor, it only meant one thing. Does that make sense? Do you understand what I'm saying there?
21.
It's abject, absolute poverty. And in order to get that idea, just think Lazarus. Okay? All right. So, abject poverty in spirit. What does that mean?
That spirit.
I'm sorry?
Go ahead, Laura.
I was just gonna say it's a disposition.
Okay.
In spirit, I guess it would, I don't know if they're talking like a person that's just beat down or.
Well, certainly someone, we might talk about someone being crushed in
Yeah.
spirit, right? And certainly that would have to do, or that would be one way that in spirit could be described. It could be talking about their heart, their spirit.
Yeah.
The idea here is spiritual.
That's what I thought. Yeah.
Okay, so it's spiritual. It's being spiritually destitute. It's being it's a statement of spiritual poverty, not spiritual wealth, not spiritual sufficiency, but but spiritual poverty. And that's the idea here, is that on a spiritual level, I have absolutely nothing to offer for myself. I don't have anything that I can bring to God and say, God, here's what I have to offer you. Here's why you should have a relationship with me. Here's why you should let me have a relationship with you. Here's what I bring to the table. Here's what I have to offer. I don't have anything to offer God. I don't have any benefit in the sense of a relationship, in the sense of what God gets out of it. What he gets out of it is a relationship with me, but I don't have anything to entice God in that relationship and see God, here's why you ought to save me. It's a statement of being spiritually destitute. My resume is blank. I don't have anything that I can list to entice God. He's not impressed with my money, my education. He's not impressed with my family or my own natural abilities or whatever morality I may have. I can't come to God and say, "Hey, look what a good person I am. You really want me to have a relationship with you." Poor in spirit says, I don't have anything that deserves a relationship with God. There's no basis on which I can come bragging to the Lord. This is a place of, as has already been said, this is a place of humility. This is a place of brokenheartedness. Say more about that in a minute. This is a place of penitence, a place of contrition. And those are the ones for whom the kingdom of heaven is reserved. Those are the ones who have their place, who will submit to the rule of God. All right. Yeah, I just now realized that I had a message from Jim, and he said the example of Jesus washing the apostles' feet, and that's a great illustration. Jesus embodied this kind of humility. Absolutely. All right. Does that make sense? So I'll ask you. Obviously, Jesus is the perfect example. Okay. So, but we're gonna go outside of that for just a moment. Can you think of a Bible example, Old Testament, New Testament, it doesn't matter, of someone that you would consider to be poor in spirit?
The widow that had
Mites.
very little money.
Two
Yeah.
mites. That's what I was
Yeah,
thinking of.
yeah, we think of the widow's mite. Two
Yeah.
mites, she gave them both. Yeah, this was and she was quite literally impoverished. Jesus said she gave her entire livelihood, but we see her spiritual humility in giving that to the Lord. Good. What else?
The best example I can think of is what David says of himself with a contrite heart.
Yeah, absolutely. Psalm 51. Yeah, absolutely. And David is such a great example in that regard, because here's someone who, if anybody was in a position to brag about what they had to offer the Lord, you know, Lord, you made me king, and here's how I've expanded the borders of your kingdom. And, here's all the great things that I've done. And oh, by the way, I'm, amassing quite a treasury here that my son Solomon is going to use to build your temple, Lord. You don't, when you read Psalm 51 among other passages, and you don't get that.
When Jesus, he asked the apostles, whom do they say he is or was or is, I guess, but was it Peter that said, to whom shall we go? The others that left said, yeah, thou have the words of life. I guess, he realized there was nothing else except
Sure.
Jesus.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, good. I think example of the publican or the tax collector in Luke chapter 18, the one who would not even so much as lift his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. That's kind of the one snapshot. If I had to pick one snapshot, that's the one that I think captures that picture. And especially when it's contrasted with the Pharisee in that story who says, Lord, I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I get. He's bragging about what he is offering the Lord. But the publican, the tax collector, says, I've got nothing, God. And that there's a real contrast there.
And Jim said John the Baptist.
Oh yeah. Who's, I'm unworthy to even untie his shoe or untie his sandal. Talking about in relation to Jesus. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so again, a lot of what we've said about spiritual poverty connects to the second beatitude. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. I cannot tell you how many times I have heard this used in the context of a funeral, as if to tell the mourners at a funeral, it's a good thing for you to mourn. Okay, let's be very clear. Solomon says it's better to go to the house of mourning. He says that in the book of Ecclesiastes. I believe it's chapter 7, if memory serves me correctly. Is it good to mourn in that sense? Yes, it is. There are spiritual lessons to be learned. Is that what Jesus is talking about here?
Your sins and others too.
Okay, I think that's exactly right. The idea is, blessed are those who mourn over those who realize their own spiritual poverty, who mourn over their own sins. You realize that you've got nothing to bring to the Lord and that you are hopelessly and completely lost on your own. Blessed are those who mourn over that, who realize that they are completely and totally hopeless on their own. And I think that is the idea. I think that fits with the context of the gospel of the kingdom and with the Beatitudes as a whole. Something I want to point out about this: blessed are those who have mourned. Is that what it says?
That mourn.
Okay.
That's ongoing.
There you go. This is an ongoing thing. just like it's not blessed are those who have been poor in spirit at some point in their life. Blessed are those who are poor in spirit. That's the idea. Blessed are those who do mourn, who continue to mourn. And so here's what I don't want you to lose sight of in this, is that these are not merely entrance requirements to the kingdom. These are the characters of those who are in the kingdom. Do you understand the difference in what I'm saying? It's not just, okay, I can check that off the list and that off the list and that off the list. And if I've got my checklist, then God lets me in the kingdom and I've got my ticket punched and I'm good to go. Yes, these are the characteristics to have access to the kingdom, but I can't stay in the kingdom if I ignore these going forward, right? If I'm going to continually submit to the Lord as king, if I'm going to be a good citizen of the king, then I must live with the constant awareness of my own spiritual poverty, that I am in a relationship with the king, but it's not of my own merit. I'm going to constantly, when I recall my sins and my spiritual poverty, I mourn over that because I've sinned against the king. That's an ongoing thing. That's not something that's momentary or temporary or limited to entrance. This is about being a citizen of the kingdom. Blessed are those who mourn. They'll be comforted, not by their own spiritual wealth, not by their own sinless perfection, not because they're better than everybody else, but they'll be comforted because they'll have a relationship with the Lord. God does the comforting. All right, I'm about to get kicked off here. I have less than a minute, and it's said that probably for 2 minutes, so it's giving me fair warning. I didn't make it as far. I sincerely apologize about the technical difficulties, and hopefully it will be better next Wednesday night. Thank you all for studying with me tonight, and thank you for your patience. Y'all have a great rest of the week. See you on Sunday, Lord willing. Good night, everybody.
Good night. Bye.
Right.